Marcus Thompson stood perfectly still in his crimson uniform,
Aye!
his polished boots reflecting the golden light streaming through the palace windows. For 8 years, he had served as a royal guard at Buckingham Palace, watching over the royal family with unwavering dedication. His life followed a precise routine: wake at 5 in the morning, physical training, uniform inspection. Then, 12 hours of standing guard with military precision. The other guards respected Marcus for his discipline and reliability. He never complained, never missed a shift, and never broke protocol. But deep inside, Marcus felt something missing. Every day was the same, every moment predictable. He longed for something more meaningful. Something that would make his skills and training truly matter. Marcus had grown up in a small mountain village in Scotland, where his father worked as a rescue coordinator for the local mountain rescue team. As a child, Marcus watched helicopters take off into dangerous weather, carrying brave pilots who risked everything to save strangers in trouble. His father often told him stories about daring rescues, about pilots who flew into storms that others feared to face. Those stories planted a seed in young Marcus's heart. When he turned 18, Marcus joined the military instead of following his father's path. He excelled in training, learned discipline, and eventually earned his place among the elite royal guards. The position brought honor and respect, but it also brought routine that slowly wore away at his spirit. Every night, he returned to his small apartment near the palace, wondering if this was all his life would ever be. One cold December evening, Marcus received a phone call that changed everything. His father's voice was heavy with sadness as he delivered the news. "Son, there's been an accident in the mountains. 3 climbers are trapped on Ben Nevis. The weather is getting worse, and we need experienced helicopter pilots. Our regular pilot is sick, and the backup pilot crashed during training last week." Marcus felt his heart race. "What about the other rescue teams, Dad? Everyone is stretched thin because of the storms. We have a helicopter, but no one qualified to fly it in these conditions. The climbers won't survive the night if we don't reach them soon." His father paused. "I know you had helicopter training in the military before you became a guard. I also know this might sound crazy, but would you consider helping us?" Marcus looked around his apartment, at his pressed uniforms hanging in perfect rows, at his military awards displayed on the wall. For 8 years, he had protected people who were already safe, surrounded by walls and security. Now, his father was asking him to save people who truly needed help, people whose lives hung in the balance. "I haven't flown in 3 years. Dad and I've never flown in mountain rescue conditions." "I understand, son. But you're the only hope these people have. Your military training was excellent, and I believe you still have those skills inside you. More importantly, you have something that can't be taught: the heart of someone who cares about others." Marcus walked to his window and looked out at the peaceful palace grounds. Security lights illuminated perfectly manicured gardens where nothing dangerous ever happened. In a few hours, he would put on his uniform again, stand at his post again, watch another day pass without making any real difference in the world. He thought about the 3 climbers on the mountain, probably cold and frightened, hoping someone would come for them. He imagined their families waiting for news, praying for a miracle. Then he thought about his own life, about the dreams he had buried under years of routine and protocol. "I'll need to request emergency leave from my commanding officer," Marcus said finally. "Are you sure, son? This could be dangerous. The weather report shows the worst blizzard in 20 years heading toward the mountain." Marcus smiled for the first time in months. "Dad, I've been preparing for something like this my whole life. I just didn't realize it until now." The next morning, Marcus submitted his emergency leave request, explaining that a family crisis required his immediate attention. His commanding officer, Colonel Hayes, studied the paperwork with curiosity. Marcus had never requested emergency leave before. "Is everything all right, Thompson? You seem different today." Marcus stood at attention, but inside he felt more alive than he had in years. "Sir, sometimes a man discovers that his true duty lies beyond the walls he's been guarding." Colonel Hayes raised an eyebrow, but signed a leave request. "Take care of yourself, Thompson. We'll see you next week." As Marcus packed his gear, he felt nervous excitement building in his chest. He was trading his safe, predictable life for something unknown and dangerous. His hands shook slightly as he folded his civilian clothes, wondering if he was making the biggest mistake of his career or the best decision of his life. Before leaving London, Marcus stopped by a military supply store and purchased cold-weather gear, emergency rations, and a detailed map of the Scottish Highlands. He also called his father back to get more details about the rescue helicopter and the trapped climbers. The helicopter is a Westland Sea King, similar to what you trained on in the military, his father explained. The climbers are experienced mountaineers, but they got caught in an unexpected ice storm. They managed to radio their position before their communication equipment failed. Marcus felt his training coming back to him as he visualized the rescue mission. The technical aspects seemed manageable, but flying in a blizzard would test every skill he possessed. More importantly, 3 lives would depend on his ability to overcome his fears and perform under pressure. As the train carried him north towards Scotland, Marcus watched the landscape change from busy cities to rolling hills to rugged mountains. With each mile, he felt the weight of his decision more deeply. He was no longer just a guard following orders. He was about to become someone who mattered, someone whose actions could save lives or end them. The train whistle blew as they approached his destination. And Marcus Thompson, prepared to discover what kind of hero he could become? The mountain rescue station buzzed with urgent activity when Marcus arrived. His father, James Thompson, rushed to greet him at the door, relief evident in his weathered face. Around them, rescue team members checked equipment, studied weather reports, and spoke in hushed, serious tones about the deteriorating conditions on Ben Nevis. "Thank God you're here," son James said, embracing Marcus tightly. "The situation is getting worse by the hour. The weather service is predicting winds up to 70 miles per hour, and visibility will drop to almost zero once the main storm hits." Marcus looked around the rescue station, taking in the maps covering every wall, the radio equipment crackling with static reports, and the faces of experienced mountain rescuers who looked genuinely worried. This was a different world from the controlled environment of the palace, where the greatest danger was usually a tourist trying to climb the gates. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the team's medical coordinator, approached them with a clipboard full of information about the trapped climbers. She was a small woman with determined eyes and hands that never seemed to stop moving as she organized rescue supplies. The 3 climbers are members of an experienced mountaineering club from Edinburgh, she explained. Robert Chen is 32, an engineer with 15 years of climbing experience. Lisa Rodriguez is 28, a physical therapist who has climbed mountains all over Europe. The 3rd climber, David Park, is only 19, but he's been climbing since he was 12 with his father. Marcus studied their photographs, committing their faces to memory. These weren't just statistics or mission objectives. They were real people with families, dreams, and futures that depended on his ability to reach them in time. "What's their current condition?" Marcus asked. Dr. Mitchell's expression grew more serious. "Based on their last radio contact 6 hours ago, Robert has a possible broken leg from a fall. Lisa was hypothermic but conscious. David was uninjured but helping to keep the others warm. Since then, we've heard nothing." James led Marcus outside to see the helicopter that would carry them into the storm. The Westland Sea King sat on the landing pad like a sleeping giant, its rotor blades secured against the increasing wind. Marcus ran his hands along the aircraft's hull, feeling the cold metal beneath his fingers and remembering his military training. "She's been maintained perfectly," said Tom Bradley, the station's head mechanic. "I've checked every system twice. The engines are running smooth, navigation equipment is calibrated, and we've loaded her with emergency medical supplies, blankets, and enough fuel for a 4-hour mission." Marcus climbed into the pilot's seat and began his pre-flight inspection. His hands moved automatically over the controls, his muscle memory taking over as he checked instruments, tested communications, and reviewed emergency procedures. It felt strange but familiar, like returning to a home he had forgotten he missed. The radio crackled to life with an update from the weather station. "Mountain Rescue Base. This is Highland Weather Service. The storm front is moving faster than predicted. You have maybe 90 minutes before conditions become completely unflyable. After that, visibility will be 0, and winds will exceed safe operating limits for any aircraft. Marcus felt pressure building in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. 90 minutes meant he had to reach the climbers, load them into the helicopter, and return to base before the worst of the blizzard hit. There would be no room for mistakes, no second chances. His father climbed into the co-pilot seat, bringing with him a thermos of hot coffee and a detailed topographical map marked with the climber's last known position. "I've been coordinating mountain rescues for 23 years, James said quietly. I've seen pilots turn back because of weather much better than what's coming. No one would blame you if you decided this was too dangerous." Marcus looked at his father, seeing worry and pride mixed together in the older man's eyes. "Dad, those people are counting on us. And honestly, I need to know if I have the courage to do something that really matters." As they prepared for takeoff, Dr. Mitchell loaded emergency medical equipment into the helicopter's cargo area. She would stay at the base to coordinate communications and prepare for the injured climber's return. Other rescue team members gathered around the aircraft, their faces showing the mixture of hope and concern that Marcus was beginning to recognize as normal in this line of work. The helicopter's engines roared to life, sending vibrations through the airframe that Marcus felt in his bones. Snow had begun falling more heavily, and the wind was picking up strength. Through the windscreen, he could see the dark outline of Ben Nevis rising into low, threatening clouds. "Radio check," Marcus spoke into his headset. "Boz, this is Rescue 1. How do you copy?" "Rescue 1, this is base. We copy you loud and clear. Weather radar shows the storm intensifying rapidly. Suggest you begin your approach immediately." Marcus pulled up on the collective, feeling the familiar sensation of the helicopter lifting off the ground. As they climbed higher, the palace guard's world of ceremonies and protocol fell away below them, replaced by rugged mountains, swirling snow. In the urgent mission ahead, his father navigated using GPS coordinates and local knowledge of the mountain's terrain. The climbers were attempting a winter ascent of the north face. They got caught in an ice slide near the 4,000 foot. Llewellyn took shelter in a small cave system known locally as Eagle's Rest. Through the helicopter's windows, Marcus could see the landscape growing more hostile with each passing minute. What had been light snow at the base was becoming a serious blizzard as they gained altitude. The wind buffeted the aircraft, requiring constant corrections to maintain their heading. There, James pointed to a dark cliff face barely visible through the swirling snow. Eagle's Rest should be about 200 meters up that ridge. But Marcus, the wind shear near those cliffs is going to be severe. And with this visibility, landing will be nearly impossible. Marcus studied the terrain below, his military training helping him assess the tactical challenges they faced. The mountain was beautiful, but unforgiving, with steep drops, exposed rock faces, and whether that could kill the unprepared. He realized that his years of discipline and precision as a royal guard, while different from this situation, had prepared him for the mental focus he needed now. Make it work. "Dad, we have to." As they flew deeper into the storm, Marcus felt himself changing from the predictable palace guard he had been into someone he had never imagined he could become. Behind them, the rescue station grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared completely into the gray, swirling world of the blizzard. The helicopter shuddered violently as they climbed through the storm clouds surrounding Ben Nevis. Marcus gripped the controls tighter, fighting against wind gusts that seemed determined to throw them against the mountain's rocky face. Snow pelted the windscreen so heavily that the wipers could barely keep up, creating brief moments of visibility between sweeps. "Visibility is down to less than 50 meters, James reported, his voice tense through the headset. "GPS shows we're approaching the target area, but I can't see anything through this weather." Marcus checked his instruments repeatedly, relying on altitude readings and navigation equipment as the world outside became a white void. The helicopter's engines strained against the thin mountain air and fierce winds. Every few seconds, powerful gusts would grab the aircraft and try to push it off course, requiring immediate corrections that tested his reflexes and training through the radio static. Dr. Mitchell's voice reached them from the base station. "Rescue 1, Weather Service reports winds increasing to 80 miles per hour. You have perhaps 30 minutes before conditions become completely unsafe for flight operations. The pressure was building, but Marcus forced himself to stay focused. In the Royal Guard, he had learned to maintain composure under stress, though nothing had prepared him for this level of danger. The lives of 3 people hung in the balance. Every decision he made in the next few minutes would determine whether they lived or died. There. James suddenly pointed through a brief break in the swirling snow. I can see the cliff face. Eagle's Rest should be just above that rocky outcrop. Marcus maneuvered the helicopter closer to the mountain, feeling the aircraft buck and shake as wind currents bounced off the steep terrain. The rotor blades whipped through the air just meters from solid rock, creating a dangerous dance between machine and mountain that required absolute precision. As they hovered near the cliff face, Marcus spotted movement below. 3 figures huddled together in a small cave opening, waving frantically at the helicopter. Even from a distance, he could see that one person was lying down while the other 2 tried to keep him warm. I see them, Marcus announced, but landing here is going to be nearly impossible. The wind shear is too severe, and there's no flat ground large enough for the helicopter. James studied the terrain below, his experienced eyes searching for solutions. There's a small ledge about 50 meters down the slope. It might be wide enough if you can get us close, but we'll have to use the rescue winch to bring them up one at a time. Marcus had trained on winch operations during his military service, but never in conditions this extreme. The procedure would require him to hold the helicopter in a perfect hover while his father operated the winch to lower a rescue harness down to the trapped climbers. With the wind constantly trying to push them into the mountain, it would be like threading a needle during an earthquake. Base, this is Rescue 1, Marcus radioed. We have visual contact with the climbers. Beginning winch rescue operation now. The helicopter descended toward the narrow ledge, Marcus making tiny adjustments to account for the shifting wind patterns. His hands moved constantly on the controls, feeling every gust and responding instinctively to keep the aircraft stable. The margin for error was virtually zero. Too far from the mountain and the winch cable wouldn't reach. Too close, and the rotor blades would strike the rock face. Through the cargo door, James prepared the rescue equipment while staying in constant communication. Steady, Marcus. Hold her right there. I'm lowering the harness now. The rescue harness disappeared into the swirling snow, connected to the helicopter by a thin cable that represented the only lifeline for the people below. Marcus watched his instruments while feeling the helicopter respond to every wind gust, making corrections that had become pure instinct. Minutes passed like hours as James worked the winch controls. Finally, his voice came through the headset with relief and urgency. I've got the injured climber. It's Robert Chen, and he's conscious, but in bad shape. Bringing him up now. The helicopter shuddered as the winch pulled additional weight up through the storm. Marcus felt the aircraft's balance shift and compensated immediately, his training taking over as he maintained their precarious position. Every second stretched endlessly as they fought against the mountain and the weather to save a life. He's secured, James announced as he helped Robert Chen into the helicopter's cabin. The injured climber was pale and shivering, with an obviously broken leg, but his eyes showed gratitude and determination to survive. 2 more to go, Marcus said, repositioning the helicopter for another winch operation. The storm was getting worse, and he could feel the aircraft struggling against increasingly powerful wind gusts. Fuel consumption was higher than normal due to the constant power adjustments needed to maintain hover, and time was running out before they would have to return to base. The second rescue went more smoothly. As Lisa Rodriguez was lifted into the helicopter, she was hypothermic but alert, and she immediately began helping James care for Robert's injuries. Her medical training as a physical therapist proved valuable as she assessed his condition and helped stabilize him for the flight. Back to base. The final rescue presented the greatest challenge. David Park, the youngest climber, was positioned in the most difficult spot on the rocky ledge. The wind had shifted, creating even more turbulent conditions around the cliff face. Marcus had to fly the helicopter at an angle that pushed both his skills and the aircraft's capabilities to their limits. As the rescue harness descended toward David, A massive gust of wind suddenly grabbed the helicopter and threw it sideways toward the mountain. Marcus reacted instantly, pulling power and banking away from the cliff face. But the sudden movement caused the winch cable to swing wildly. Cables tangled on the rocks. James shouted, "We're going to have to reposition and try again." But the weather was deteriorating rapidly, and Marcus could see that they were running out of time. The storm was reaching its peak intensity, and continuing the rescue operation much longer would put all of them in mortal danger. He had to make a choice that would define him as both a pilot and a human being. Looking down at David Park, alone on the mountain as his two companions sat safely in the helicopter, Marcus realized that this moment would determine whether he truly had the heart of a hero, or would remain forever a guard who played it safe. The young climber's life depended on his next decision. Marcus stared down at David Park through the swirling snow, seeing the young man's face filled with fear and hope. The 19-year-old climber stood alone on the narrow ledge, watching his only chance of survival hover precariously in the deadly storm. The tangled winch cable swayed uselessly in the wind, and Marcus knew they had perhaps minutes before the weather would force them to abandon the rescue entirely. "The cable is completely fouled," James reported, his voice heavy with frustration. "It'll take several minutes to clear it, and we don't have that much time before this storm makes flying impossible." Through the radio, Dr. Mitchell's urgent voice crackled from the base station. "Rescue 1, weather radar shows the eye wall of the storm approaching your position. You need to return to base immediately or risk losing everyone." Marcus felt the helicopter shaking more violently with each passing second. The wind speed had increased beyond safe operating limits, and ice was beginning to form on the rotor blades. His military training screamed at him to retreat, to save the people he had already rescued rather than risk everyone for one person. But as he looked down at David Park, Marcus saw something that changed everything. The young climber wasn't panicking or giving up. Instead, he was waving them away, gesturing for the helicopter to leave without him. David understood the situation and was trying to sacrifice himself to ensure the others would survive. "That kid has more courage than most soldiers I've known," Marcus said quietly. "I'm not leaving him behind." "Marcus, be reasonable," his father pleaded. "If we stay much longer, we'll all die. You can't save someone by killing everyone else." Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of command and responsibility that he had never experienced as a royal guard. In his previous life, decisions were made for him by protocol and procedure. Now, he alone had to choose between the safe path and the right path. "Dad, can you clear that cable manually if I can get us closer to the cliff face?" James looked at his son with a mixture of pride and terror. The only way to reach the cable would be to open the cargo door and lean out into the wind. In these conditions, it would be incredibly dangerous. More dangerous than leaving that boy to die? Without waiting for an answer, Marcus began maneuvering the helicopter closer to the mountain. The aircraft bucked and pitched like an angry horse as wind currents slammed into them from multiple directions. Ice crystals pelted the windscreen, and the engine strained against the thin air in extreme weather. James moved to the cargo door and began putting on safety harnesses. "If we're doing this, we're doing it right. Give me 2 minutes to get secured, then hold us as steady as you can." The next few minutes tested every skill Marcus had learned in his military training. He had to hold the helicopter in position while his father worked outside in hurricane-force winds, trusting his life to safety equipment and Marcus's flying ability. The aircraft shuddered and bucked, requiring constant corrections to prevent it from being thrown into the cliff face. Through the headset, Marcus could hear his father struggling against the wind as he worked to free the tangled cable. Metal scraped against rock, and James grunted with effort as he fought to clear the obstruction that stood between David Park and survival. "Almost got it," James reported, his voice barely audible over the wind noise. "The cable is wrapped around a rock outcrop, but I think I can... There, it's free." The rescue harness dropped through the swirling snow toward David Park, who grabbed it immediately and began securing it around his body. Marcus watched the young climber work with steady hands despite the mortal danger surrounding him, showing the kind of calm competence under pressure that Marcus recognized from his own military training. But as the winch began lifting David from the ledge, disaster struck. A massive downdraft slammed into the helicopter from above, pushing it downward, toward the mountain at an alarming rate. Marcus pulled full power and fought the controls, but the aircraft continued descending toward the rocky terrain below. "We're going to hit the mountain," James shouted over the intercom. Marcus felt time slowed down as his training took complete control. He rolled the helicopter into a steep banking turn, using the mountain's own wind currents to help lift them away from the cliff face. The maneuver was incredibly risky in these conditions, but it was their only chance to avoid a crash that would kill everyone aboard. The helicopter's rotor blades came within meters of the rock face as Marcus executed the desperate maneuver. David Park, still suspended on the winch cable, swung wildly through the air as the aircraft pivoted around him. For a terrifying moment, it looked like the cable might snap under the extreme forces, but Marcus's years of discipline and precision flying paid off. The helicopter cleared the mountain and began climbing back to a safe altitude. With David Park safely secured on the winch cable below them, James quickly worked to bring the young climber up into the aircraft's cabin, where he collapsed with exhaustion and relief. "All 3 climbers are aboard," James reported to the base station. "We're beginning our return flight now." But their ordeal was far from over. The storm had reached its peak intensity while they were conducting the rescue, and the flight back to base would be through weather conditions that pushed both pilot and machine beyond their normal limits. Visibility was essentially zero, winds exceeded 80 miles per hour, and ice was accumulating on the helicopter's critical surfaces. Marcus began the long, dangerous journey home, flying entirely on instruments through a storm that seemed determined to claim them all. In the cabin behind him, Dr. Mitchell's voice guided James through emergency medical procedures for Robert Chen's injuries, while Lisa Rodriguez and David Whereas Park huddled together under rescue blankets. The radio crackled with updates from the base station, but the signal was weakening as the storm interfered with communications. Marcus realized they were truly on their own now. Flying through a white hell with no ground references and no backup plan, something went wrong. As they descended through the storm clouds, Marcus felt the helicopter beginning to ice up more severely. The aircraft's performance was degrading. He knew they were approaching the limits of what was possible in these conditions. The base was still 20 minutes away, but he wasn't sure the helicopter could maintain flight that much longer in the worsening weather. It was then that Marcus understood the true meaning of heroism. It wasn't about making one brave decision, but about continuing to make brave decisions even when everything seemed hopeless. He had already saved 3 lives, but now he had to save them again by getting everyone safely back to the ground. The helicopter struggled through the storm like a wounded bird, ice building up on its rotor blades and reducing lift with every passing minute. Marcus fought the controls as the aircraft became increasingly sluggish and unpredictable. The weight of ice, combined with the fierce winds, was pushing the helicopter toward its operational limits. "Base, this is Rescue 1, Marcus called into the radio, receiving only static in response. The storm had completely cut off their communications, leaving them isolated in a world of swirling white chaos. He was flying blind through one of the worst blizzards in Scottish history, with no ground reference points and failing equipment behind him in the cabin. James worked desperately to keep Robert Chen stable. The injured climber's condition had worsened during the turbulent flight, and his broken leg had begun bleeding more heavily. Lisa Rodriguez assisted with the medical care while David Park, still shivering from his time on the mountain, tried to help however he could. "Marcus," his father called over the intercom, "Robert's going into shock. We need to get him to a hospital within the next 15 minutes, or we might lose him." The pressure was enormous, but Marcus forced himself to stay calm and focused. His years as a royal guard had taught him to perform under stress, though nothing had prepared him for responsibility of this magnitude, for lives now depended on his ability to navigate through impossible conditions and land safely at the rescue base. Suddenly, the helicopter shuddered violently as one of the engines began to falter. Warning lights flashed on the instrument panel, and Marcus felt his heart race as he realized they were experiencing a partial engine failure. The aircraft could still fly on one engine, but not in these weather conditions with the added weight of ice accumulation. "Engine 2 is losing power," Marcus announced, trying to keep his voice steady. "We're going to have to make an emergency landing." Through brief breaks in the swirling snow, Marcus caught glimpses of the landscape below. They were still in the mountains, far from any flat ground suitable for landing. The terrain was rocky and steep, covered with snow that could hide deadly obstacles. An emergency landing in these conditions would be incredibly dangerous. But continuing to fly with a failing engine would be suicide. James moved to the co-pilot seat. Bringing his knowledge of the local geography, there's a small valley about 5 miles northeast of our position. It's used for sheep grazing in summer, so it should be relatively flat. If we can make it there, we might have a chance. Marcus adjusted their heading toward the valley, feeling the helicopter lose altitude steadily as the remaining engines struggled to maintain lift. The ice buildup was getting worse, and he could feel the aircraft becoming more unstable with each passing minute. Control responses were sluggish, and it was taking more and more power to maintain forward flight. The fuel gauge showed they had perhaps 10 minutes of flying time remaining under current conditions. Marcus realized they would get exactly one chance to land safely. If he misjudged the approach or encountered unexpected obstacles, there would be no opportunity for a second attempt. Through the storm, the outline of the valley began to emerge. It looked deceptively peaceful under its blanket of snow, but Marcus knew that hidden rocks, fence posts, or uneven ground could turn their landing into a deadly crash. He would have to bring the heavy helicopter down in near-zero visibility with failing equipment, carrying injured passengers who desperately needed medical attention. "Everyone secure yourselves," Marcus announced over the intercom. "We're going in." The descent began smoothly, but as they approached the ground, wind currents in the valley created severe turbulence. The helicopter bounced and pitched unpredictably, and Marcus fought to maintain control as they dropped through the swirling snow toward the invisible ground below. At 50 feet above the valley floor, Marcus caught a brief glimpse of the landing area through a break in the weather. What he saw made his blood run cold. The field was not flat as expected, but crossed by a series of stone walls and dotted with large boulders that would be deadly. Obstacles during landing. There was no time to find another landing site. The engine was failing rapidly, and they were committed to this approach, whether it killed them or not. Marcus made split-second calculations, trying to identify the safest path between the obstacles he had glimpsed. The helicopter touched down hard, bouncing once before settling onto the snow-covered ground. The landing gear sank deep into soft snow, but they were down safely. Marcus shut down the remaining engine and sat in the sudden silence, hardly believing they had survived the ordeal. But their troubles were far from over. They were stranded in a remote valley during the worst storm in decades, with an injured man who needed immediate medical attention and no way to communicate with the outside world. The helicopter was damaged and would not fly again without major repairs. James immediately began organizing their survival priorities. "We need to get Robert into the cabin where we can keep him warm and treat his injuries properly. Then we need to set up some kind of shelter and wait for the storm to pass." Using emergency supplies from the helicopter, they created a makeshift medical station in the aircraft's cabin. Lisa Rodriguez took charge of Robert's care, using her physical therapy background to stabilize his injuries as best she could. David Park, despite his own exhaustion, helped gather survival equipment and prepare for what could be a long wait for rescue. Marcus stepped outside into the howling wind to assess their situation. The storm showed no signs of weakening, and snow was falling so heavily that their helicopter was already partially buried. He realized that even when the weather cleared, it might take days for rescue teams to locate them in this remote valley. As he stood in the blizzard, Marcus reflected on how much his life had changed in just 24 hours. Yesterday, he had been a palace guard, following predictable routines and avoiding risk. Today, he had flown through a deadly storm, saved 3 lives, and crash-landed in the Scottish wilderness. The transformation felt both terrifying and liberating. But the real test of his character was just beginning. Now he had to keep everyone alive through the long, cold night ahead. With limited supplies and no guarantee that help would come in time, The skills he had learned as a Royal Guard, discipline, leadership under pressure, an unwavering commitment to protecting others would be put through their ultimate test in the mountains of Scotland. Inside the helicopter, Robert Chen stirred and opened his eyes, looking at Marcus with gratitude and trust. "Thank you for coming back for us," he whispered. "I thought we were going to die on that mountain." Marcus knelt beside the injured climber, feeling the full weight of responsibility for the lives in his care. "We're not out of danger yet," he said quietly. "But I promise you this, I didn't risk everything to save you, just to let you die now. We're all going home." The long night in the valley tested everyone's endurance and will to survive. Marcus organized survival efforts while the blizzard raged outside their damaged helicopter. He rationed emergency supplies, maintained the heating system that kept them from freezing, and took responsibility for everyone's morale during the darkest hours. Robert and his condition stabilized under Lisa Rodriguez's careful medical attention. But he remained weak and needed constant monitoring. David Park, despite being the youngest member of their group, proved invaluable in helping maintain their shelter and spirits. James Thompson used his mountain rescue experience to assess weather conditions and plan for what would come next. As dawn broke over the Scottish Highlands, the storm finally began to weaken. Marcus was the first to venture outside, wading through snow that reached his waist in some places. The helicopter was almost completely buried, but the valley around them revealed breathtaking beauty under its blanket of fresh snow. More importantly, he could see clear sky appearing through breaks in the clouds. "The weather is clearing," he announced as he returned to the others. "It won't be long before rescue teams can start looking for us." But Marcus knew they couldn't simply wait for help to arrive. Robert needed proper medical attention soon, and their supplies wouldn't last indefinitely in these remote conditions. Using the helicopter's emergency radio, he managed to establish weak contact with the rescue base during brief moments when atmospheric conditions allowed signals to get through. "Base, this is Marcus Thompson. We made an emergency landing in Sheep Valley approximately 8 miles northeast of your position. All survivors are alive, but we have one seriously injured person requiring immediate medical evacuation." The response came through heavy static, but Dr. Mitchell's voice was unmistakable with relief. "Marcus, thank God you're alive. We've had search teams ready to deploy since the storm began clearing. Can you give us a more precise location?" Using landmarks visible from their position, Marcus provided detailed coordinates while James helped identify specific geographic features that would guide the rescue helicopters to their location. Within 2 hours, they could hear the distant sound of rotor blades cutting through the crisp. Mountain air to rescue helicopters appeared over the valley rim, their pilots displaying the same kind of courage and skill that Marcus had shown during his mission. The lead aircraft landed carefully in the snow, while the second maintained a protective overwatch position above, as rescue personnel rushed to help Robert Chen and the other survivors. Marcus felt a profound sense of completion. The scared palace guard who had left London seemed like a different person entirely. Through facing his fears and pushing beyond what he thought possible, he had discovered capabilities within himself that he never knew existed. Dr. Mitchell approached Marcus as the medical team prepared Robert for transport. "What you did yesterday was extraordinary. Flying in those conditions, with your level of experience, saving all 3 climbers, it shouldn't have been possible." Marcus watched as Robert Chen was carefully loaded into the rescue helicopter. Conscious and stable thanks to Lisa Rodriguez's medical care and their night of survival in the valley. David Park stood beside the aircraft, no longer the frightened young climber trapped on a mountain ledge, but someone who had learned firsthand about courage and human resilience. "I had good people with me," Marcus replied. "My father taught me that rescue work is always a team effort. No one succeeds alone in the mountains." The flight back to the rescue base was smooth and peaceful, stark contrast to the previous day's harrowing journey through the storm. As they approached the landing pad, Marcus could see crowds of people waiting, rescue team members, medical personnel, and reporters who had learned about the dramatic rescue mission. But the person Marcus most wanted to see was Colonel Hayes, his commanding officer from the Royal Guard, who had traveled from London after hearing about his emergency leave request. The colonel stood apart from the crowd. his expression unreadable as the helicopter touched down. After ensuring that all the survivors were safely transferred to medical care, Marcus approached Colonel Hayes with some trepidation. His unauthorized absence could result in disciplinary action or even dismissal from the Royal Guard. Consequences he was prepared to accept for what he had accomplished. "Thompson," Colonel Hayes said formally, "I understand you've been having quite an adventure." "Yes, sir." "I realize my actions may have violated protocols, but I felt I had no choice given the circumstances." Colonel Hayes studied Marcus for a long moment, taking in his appearance after the ordeal, tired, unshaven, and completely transformed from the perfectly groomed guard who had left London. "Thompson, in 30 years of military service, I've learned to recognize when a man discovers his true calling. What you did here took the kind of courage and skill that can't be taught in any training program." Marcus felt relief wash over him as he realized his career wasn't ending. But the colonel's next words surprised him even more. "The Royal Guard will always have a place for you, Thompson, but I suspect your talents might be better utilized elsewhere. The Mountain Rescue Service has been asking about you. I understand they're offering you a permanent position as a pilot and rescue coordinator." The decision Marcus faced was both obvious and difficult. Returning to his old life as a palace guard would mean security, routine, and respect. But staying in Scotland would mean danger, uncertainty, and the chance to save lives on a regular basis. As he watched Robert Chen being wheeled into the medical center, conscious and smiling despite his injuries, Marcus knew what his answer would be. Lisa Rodriguez waved at him from beside the ambulance, and David Park gave him a thumbs-up sign that conveyed more gratitude than words ever could. 6 months later, Marcus Thompson stood beside a rescue helicopter at the Mountain Rescue Base. Wearing the uniform of a senior pilot and rescue coordinator, the morning briefing had just ended, and his team was preparing for a training exercise that would keep their skills sharp for the next emergency call. His father approached with a cup of coffee and a weather report. "It looks like we might have some excitement later today. There's a group of hikers overdue on Cairngorm, and the weather is turning nasty again." Marcus smiled as he reviewed the mission parameters. Feeling the familiar excitement that came with knowing he might soon be called upon to save lives, his days of standing guard over people who were already safe were behind him forever. The radio crackled with an emergency call, and Marcus felt his pulse quicken as he listened to details about climbers in distress. As he ran toward his helicopter, he reflected on how a single decision to answer his father's plea for help had transformed him from a guard who protected the protected into a hero who saved the lost. The helicopter lifted off into threatening skies, carrying Marcus Thompson toward another rendezvous with danger, duty, and the kind of heroism that could only be found by those brave enough to risk everything for others. Behind him, the rescue base grew smaller, but ahead lay the mountains where heroes were made and lives were saved by people who refused to let others face their darkest moments alone.